You've been lying still for 3 hours. Not because you're hiding, though you are, but because movement in this building means sound, and sound in this city means death. And you learned that faster than you learned anything else in your 20 years of life. The floor beneath you is wet. You don't know if it's rain or something else, and you stopped asking that question weeks ago. Somewhere below, in what used to be a kitchen, a German soldier is eating. You can hear the spoon against the tin. You know his exact position. You know what you're going to do. You just need one more minute of ordinary silence. This is your story. You grew up 3 blocks from here. That's the thing nobody tells you about defending a city. It's not abstract. It's not a line on a map. It's the specific smell of a specific street on a specific morning. And when that street is on fire, something inside you burns with it in a way that has nothing to do with patriotism and everything to do with the fact that you were 7 years old on that corner once, eating an ice cream your father bought you, and the world was exactly the right size. The building you're in used to be a textile factory. You know this because your aunt worked here for 11 years, and every Sunday dinner she complained about the noise of the machines and the way the dust got into everything, her hair, her clothes, her lungs. The machines are gone now. The roof is partially gone too. What's left is a skeleton of concrete and rebar that gives you elevation, cover, and a clean line of sight across 340 meters of rubble to the building the Germans are using as a forward command post. You found the position 4 days ago. You've been here since. Your name is Natalya Kovaleva. You're 20 years old. You were studying biology at Stalingrad State University when the Germans crossed the Don, and the last time you slept in a bed was 6 weeks ago. You don't think about the bed. You've learned not to think about comfort, because comfort is a door that, once opened, is very hard to close again, and you can't afford that right now. What you think about is angles, distance, wind, the way light moves across a broken building at different hours of the day. Your mother is somewhere in this city. You don't know exactly where she refused to evacuate, the same way she's refused every inconvenient thing in her life, with a flat look and 2 words that meant the conversation was over. The last time you saw her was 5 weeks ago, across a courtyard, and she looked at you in your uniform with your rifle and said nothing, which from her meant everything. Outside, the city sounds the way it has sounded every day for 2 months. Artillery in the distance, something closer, collapsing. The specific silence that follows an explosion when everyone is deciding whether to move. You've learned to read this city by its sounds, the way you used to read it by its streets. A different kind of map. A different kind of knowing. The German soldier below has finished eating. You can tell by the silence where the spoon sound was. He's moving now, toward the window you've been watching, the one that gives him the best view of the Soviet position, to the east, which means it also gives you the best view of him. You've done this before. You know exactly how it goes. You slow your breathing down. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. The rifle becomes an extension of something. Your arm, your eye, your intention, and the line between you and it stops mattering. The window opens. You were the kind of child who noticed things. Not in a way that anyone particularly valued. Your teachers called it distraction. Your mother called it stubbornness. And your father, on the rare occasions he weighed in, called it a gift and left it at that, which was more than enough for you. What you noticed was how things worked. Not people, not feelings, not the social architecture of who sat with whom at lunch, but systems, mechanisms, the way a bicycle chain transferred force, the way water found the lowest point in any room, the way light changed the apparent distance of an object, depending on the angle you observed it from. Your father noticed you noticing. He was an engineer at the tractor factory, a quiet man who communicated primarily through demonstration rather than explanation. And one Saturday, when you were 9, he took you to the factory floor and walked you through the assembly line without saying a word, just watching your face. On the tram home, he asked what you'd seen, and you told him not what the machines made, but how they made it, the sequence, the tolerances, the places where human error was most likely to enter the system. He looked at you for a long time and then said, "You should study science." So you did. You were 16 when your father first took you hunting. This was not unusual in the Volga region. Food was practical, rifles were tools, and the line between them was not sentimental. What was unusual was how quickly you understood the rifle, not the mechanics, though those came easily enough, but the deeper thing underneath the mechanics, the stillness required, the patience, the way you had to stop trying to make something happen, and instead simply wait for the moment when it was already happening, and you were just there to witness it. Your father watched you make your third shot of the day, a clean hit at 200 meters, and said nothing. But on the walk home he gave you the rifle to carry, and he never asked for it back. At university, you studied biology because living systems fascinated you in the same way mechanical ones did the efficiency, the adaptation, the way everything that survived had found some precise answer to a precise problem. Your professor said you had the best observational instincts he'd seen in 20 years of teaching. You wrote it down in your notebook and underlined it, not from vanity, but because it felt true, and true things were worth keeping. The summer of 1942 was hot and strange. There were rumors, then more than rumors, then the sound of artillery to the west that you could hear from your dormitory window at night, lying awake, telling yourself it was far away. In July, the university was evacuated. You didn't go. You went home instead, to your mother's apartment on Krasnopeterskaya Street, and the two of you listened to the radio together and said very little, which was how you'd always communicated best. In August, you enlisted. Your mother didn't try to stop you. She helped you pack instead, methodical, silent, folding things with the precision of someone who has decided that if this is happening, then it will at least be done properly. At the door, she held your face in both hands for a long moment, looked at you with an expression you'd never seen on her before and have never been able to fully name since, and then let you go. The city was already burning when you crossed the Volga. You looked back once, then you didn't look back again. The army didn't know what to do with you at first. This wasn't unusual. The army in those months didn't know what to do with a lot of things, because the army in those months was a living organism in shock, reorganizing itself under fire, losing pieces, and growing new ones in ways nobody had planned for. But specifically, they didn't know what to do with a 20-year-old biology student from Stalingrad who'd shown up at a recruitment point with her father's hunting rifle and a calm expression that made the processing officer uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite articulate. They assigned you to a rifle unit. You were not the only woman, there were others, and the dynamic was neither as hostile as you'd feared, nor as easy as you'd hoped, which is to say it was exactly like most things in life. You learned quickly that the only currency that mattered here was competence, and competence was something you'd always been able to produce. Your first week in the city was an education in a different kind of biology, the biology of survival in an urban environment, the way human beings adapted to rubble and darkness and constant noise, the way any organism adapted to a changed environment, by shedding what wasn't necessary and sharpening what was. You shed a great deal that first week. Some of it you've never found again, and you've made your peace with that. Your sniper training was informal by any standard. There wasn't time for formal. The city was being consumed block by block, and every day of training was a day not spent defending something. What you had instead was Senior Sergeant Volkov, a 43-year-old former hunter from Siberia, who looked at your shooting record, said nothing for 30 seconds, and then spent the next 2 weeks teaching you everything he knew about patience. Not technique, you had technique. What Volkov taught you was the mental architecture of waiting, how to be in a position for 4, 6, 8 hours without your mind beginning to work against you, how to observe without anticipating, how to let time pass through you rather than pressing against it. He said once, toward the end of your time with him, the rifle is the easy part. Anyone can learn the rifle. What most people can't learn is how to become no one for as long as necessary. You understood exactly what he meant, because you'd been practicing a version of it your whole life without knowing it had a name. By October, you had 11 confirmed kills. You wrote this down in a small notebook, the way you'd once written down observations in biology class: date, distance, conditions, outcome. Not from coldness, but because recording things accurately was how you'd always made sense of them. And sense was what you needed more than anything in a city that had stopped making any. The Germans were good. You want to be accurate about this, because accuracy matters, and because underestimating them would have gotten you killed. They were disciplined, they were methodical, and some of them were very patient. You lost 2 people from your unit to German snipers in October alone. One of them, a woman named Vera, who'd been at the factory 2 floors below you, who'd told you 3 days before she died that she was going to study medicine after the war, that she'd already decided on pediatrics, that she liked the idea of working with people at the beginning of things rather than the end. You wrote Vera's name in your notebook too. Not her kill count, just her name. By November, Stalingrad had become something that didn't have a word, yet not a city, not a ruin, but a third thing, a place that existed entirely in the present tense, where the past was rubble and the future was a concept too expensive to think about. You lived in that present tense completely. You ate when there was food. You slept when there was silence. You did your job when there was a job to do. And when there wasn't, you thought about your mother on Krasnopeterskaya Street, and whether the building was still standing, and whether she was cold. December came the way. December always came to Stalingrad completely, without negotiation, turning the rubble white and the cold into something structural, something that got inside the buildings the same way it got inside you, through every gap and crack, settling into the bones of things. You'd stopped counting days sometime in November. What you counted instead were positions, yours, theirs, the shifting geometry of a city being consumed and defended simultaneously, block by block, floor by floor, sometimes room by room. You knew this part of Stalingrad better than you'd ever known it as a civilian, which was a specific kind of irony you didn't spend much time on. Your confirmed count was 19 by the first week of December. You know this not because you were proud of it, but because Volkov had told you early on that accurate record-keeping was a tactical tool, that understanding your own patterns was the only way to correct them. And you'd taken that seriously the way you took everything seriously that came from someone who clearly knew what they were doing. 19 was a number. It meant 19 fewer Germans in this city. It meant 19 moments you'd held your breath and waited and done the thing you'd trained to do. What it didn't mean, what you'd been careful from the beginning not to let it mean, was anything about the 19 themselves. That changed in December. His name was, as far as you were ever able to determine, Werner. You learned this from a letter found on his body by soldiers who cleared the position 2 days after you, not his last name, just Werner. Written in the return address of a letter from someone in Hamburg who signed herself only M. He was a sniper. You'd been tracking each other for 11 days across a 4-block area near the Red October factory. A slow and careful conversation, conducted entirely in patience and silence, and the occasional evidence of a position recently vacated. He was good, better than most. Good enough that you'd move twice in 11 days because you felt, without being able to explain it, that staying still had become dangerous in a way that your instincts understood before your reasoning could catch up. On the 11th day, you found his position before he found yours. It was a small thing, a disturbance in the frost on a windowsill that told you he'd been there recently, the angle of it telling you where he'd most likely go next, your knowledge of this specific building, which you'd played in as a child, because your school friend Masha had lived on the 2nd floor, giving you an understanding of its layout that he couldn't have. You moved to the position. You waited 4 hours. When he appeared in the window across the street, you had perhaps 2 seconds of seeing him as a person young, your age or close to it, moving with the careful economy of someone who'd been doing this long enough to be tired of it before you did what you'd come there to do. You wrote it in your notebook that evening. Date, distance, conditions, outcome. Then you sat for a long time looking at the entry without reading it. You didn't tell anyone about Werner. There was nothing to tell. It was a clean shot, a confirmed kill, tactically unremarkable. But something about the 11 days, the careful attention you'd paid to each other across those 4 blocks, the mutual and unspoken acknowledgement of an opponent worth taking seriously, had left a residue that your usual system of recording and moving on didn't quite dissolve. That was the fracture. Not in your ability. You kept doing your job, kept doing it well. The count reached 24 by January, and the German encirclement was tightening, and the end was becoming visible in the way that ends become visible. Not suddenly, but as a slow clarification of something that was always going to be true. The fracture was in the clean separation you'd maintained between the work and the meaning of the work, and once that separation developed a crack, the cold got into it, the way cold got into everything in Stalingrad that winter. In January, a letter came from your mother. It had taken 3 weeks to reach you, and was 2 paragraphs long. The building was still standing. She was eating. She'd found a cat, gray, half-starved, which she'd named Pushkin because she said it seemed like the kind of cat that would appreciate the reference. She didn't ask when you were coming home. You read the paragraph about Pushkin 4 times, not because it was remarkable, but because it was so completely ordinary, so entirely itself, that it felt like a door back to a world you weren't sure still existed. You wrote back that same night. You told her about the factory, about the cold, about a funny thing that had happened with your boots that wasn't really funny, but had made you laugh anyway, which was close enough. You didn't tell her about Werner. You didn't tell her about Vera. You told her about the boots, and you asked about Pushkin, and you folded the letter 3 times and gave it to the courier and watched him leave, and then stood in the cold for a while longer than you needed to. The city outside was white and broken and completely silent for once. It was the most beautiful it had ever looked. The 2nd of February 1943. You know the date because someone told you, and you wrote it down. And it's the first date you've written in your notebook in 6 weeks that isn't followed by distance and conditions and outcome. It's just a date, standing alone on the page, like a door that's been left open. The Germans surrendered this morning. Not all at once, it wasn't like that. It wasn't a clean moment where one thing stopped and another began. It was more like a sound gradually ceasing, the way tinnitus fades after a long time in a loud place. So slowly you can't identify the exact moment of silence, only realize at some point that the noise is gone. The artillery stopped, then the small arms fire. Then the specific quality of the air changed, the way it changes after a storm, and people began to come out of the buildings they'd been living in for 6 months. And they looked at each other in the way people look at each other when they've been through the same thing, but haven't been able to say so out loud until now. You came out of the factory building that had been your primary position for the last 3 weeks. The light was different. February light, cold and flat and honest, the kind of light that shows you everything without editorializing. The city looked, in that light, like something from a different planet, not destroyed in a way that suggested it had once been something else, but simply itself. This broken white landscape of concrete and snow and absence, as if it had always been this way, and you were seeing it clearly for the first time. You sat down on a piece of concrete that might have been a wall once, and you did something you hadn't done in 6 months. You didn't observe anything. You didn't calculate anything. You didn't maintain your position, or control your breathing, or assess the angle of the light. You just sat there, and let the silence be silence, and found that it was harder than anything you'd done in the previous 6 months, because silence, real silence, is where everything you haven't thought about lives, and it had been accumulating for a very long time. You thought about Vera. You thought about her the way you'd been careful not to think about her since October completely, with the full weight of who she'd been, the pediatrics plan, the way she'd laughed about something stupid 3 days before she died, the specific quality of her presence that the world no longer contained. You let yourself think about all of it, sitting on that piece of concrete in the February light, and it was exactly as heavy as you'd known it would be, which is why you'd been so careful not to. You thought about Werner, too. You thought about the 11 days and the letter from Hamburg and the woman who signed herself only M, who was waiting for a letter back that was never going to come, who maybe already knew that, who was probably already living in that particular kind of after that you'd watched your mother prepare for, without ever quite believing it would arrive. And you thought about your mother on Krasnopitarskaya Street, and Pushkin, the half-starved cat, and the drawer where she kept the things that mattered most, your father's letters, your first school photograph, a small pressed flower from somewhere you'd never asked about. You thought about walking to that building, up those stairs, knocking on that door. You thought about what her face would look like. You thought about the specific sound of that kitchen, that pot, that ordinary morning that you'd been carrying with you for 6 months, like a compass pointing at something you needed to believe was still there. In 3 hours, you would learn that the building was still standing. In 4 hours, you would be across the city, climbing those stairs. In 5 hours, you'd be in that kitchen, sitting at that table, and your mother would be making tea with hands that didn't shake, because she was not a woman whose hands shook. And Pushkin would be on the windowsill looking at you with the complete indifference of a creature that has survived on its own terms and sees no reason to make a fuss about it. But you didn't know any of that yet, sitting on your piece of concrete in the February light. What you knew was this: you'd come into this city as one person, and you were leaving it as another. And the distance between those two people was not measurable in the way that distances usually were, not in meters or months or the number in your notebook, but in something else entirely, something that didn't have a unit, something you'd spend the rest of your life trying to find the right language for. You picked up your rifle. You stood up. You looked at the city one more time, your city, the city you'd grown up in and defended, and would spend years rebuilding in your mind, long after the physical rubble was cleared, and you thought, I was here. I stayed. Whatever that cost, I paid it, and I'm still standing, and the morning is cold and honest, and the light is showing me everything. Then you started walking toward Krasnopeterskaya Street. One step, then another, the way everything begins again.